Well, let's talk about the headquarters, and we'll get into a second about what happened here. But give an idea for folks watching at home what happened at these headquarters and its significance, really at a defining moment of this nation.
The Continental Army spent much of the war in the Hudson Highlands. General Washington did as well. It was our most important base and largest concentration of soldiers. So all of the houses in this area at one point or another had soldiers staying at them or had officers using them as headquarters. And this house was occupied for almost 2 years, one of the longest occupied military headquarters of the war by a series of Continental Army generals.
So I think in the minds of many, once 1776 happened, America, we were on our way. But I read a recent story, and you'd be the perfect person to give this context to. In 1780 to 1783, we had some money problems, and the soldiers that we were being asked to be on the front lines of this, they hadn't been paid in months, in some cases even years, and there were many who were agitating to say, hey, the best way to make things right here is literally to have the Army threaten Congress with violence or an uprising. And we then bring ourselves to the meeting, or the conspiracy, as they said, the Newburgh meeting or conspiracy in 1783, and none other than George Washington had a defining moment, not only in that conversation with the troops, but really the direction this country in many ways went.
In 1780, you had the worst defeat of the war for the American Army. Charleston fell in May, and over 5,000 soldiers were captured. Basically, in one fell swoop, the entire Southern American Army was eliminated. We cobbed together another army under General Gates, sent them down. They were defeated at the Battle of Camden. Things were bad. The country was bankrupt. The whole paper money scheme had fallen apart. They were trying to come up with a new way to finance the war, and our government did what our government does best, borrowed money.
And there was a disagreement in the government, too, as to the obligations it had financially to the troops, right?
What they went to is specific requisitions. They tried to get the states to give in their fair share into the central pot to deliver it up to the Army as a whole, but State X is not going to give if State Y doesn't give. So the Army suffered considerably, and when I'm talking about 1780, many officers were resigning by that point, seeing the cause as hopeless. The only thing holding the Army together was the officers keeping the soldiers to their duty. So Congress agreed to, against many people's reservations, is this pension, which under the British model, a British officer, their service is an annuity to them. When the war ends and you don't need as big an army, an officer goes on half pay, and they wait. When the another war happens, they get called back on active service and get put into the new units. So America adopted that to keep the officers. By the end of the war, you don't really have a need for the Army anymore.
Yeah.
And the officers realize that.
So the officers, egged on by some to say, we got to have an insurrection here, or at least a threat of one, to get Congress to finally take our needs seriously. It had reached a boiling point. And then none other than in this place, George Washington comes in to the surprise of his troops and tries to rally them around the cause. And there was a singular moment in there that was unscripted, that in many ways changed the sentiment, brought it together, and more than 200 and almost 30 years later, we are where we are. Give an idea of what happened in that meeting, or the Newburgh meeting conspiracy as it's known.
The actual conspiracy itself originated within the Continental Congress. You had a nationalist element with certain people like Robert Morris, who was a superintendent of finance, Gouverneur Morris, the transplanted New Yorker who helped write the New York Constitution. He was also the one who helped write a good deal of the federal Constitution, Alexander Hamilton. They were all for a strong central government with the power to raise a revenue. So taking the strength of the Army and stirring the Army up to have the Army menace Congress would advance their cause to have this strong central government. So they either gave written instructions to or told verbally to an officer named Colonel Walter Stewart. and Colonel Walter Stewart arrived in camp on March 8th. He had been a former aide to General Gates, and Washington had no use for Gates. Yeah. There had been bad blood between them, and I don't know if we want to go into that, but Gates allowed his aide-de-camp, John Armstrong, to write the first letters. And when the first letters were disseminated, there was a general assumption that the letter had been written in Philadelphia. They knew Congress was behind it. But then, when Washington heard about the first letter, he said, I had hoped that officers would disregard such an irregular invitation, because the letters had called for them to meet the next day, but he banned that. And then he authorized a second meeting, one for March 15th, which gave him time to manage the crisis. And he did a very important thing. He went and talked to all the troop commanders. This is a staff plot. This is scheming staff officers. Staff officers don't command soldiers. The guys who really matter are the ones who command the troops. And he met with all of them to shore up his position, and they assured him they would not allow their troops to be used for such nefarious purposes.
There was a moment in there, like there is in so many speeches, where it's not the scripted punchline, but the delivery. And failing eyesight, give the background and then give that famous quote.
Well, Washington, by authorizing the meeting on March 15th, you just kind of wonder whether he's hearkening back to 1800 years before, where on another Ides of March, where Julius Caesar, and that decided the fate of the Western world. Maybe he just picked the day, but I'd like to think that he was thinking that date's pretty important. So he authorizes this meeting, and all it was supposed to be is a meeting for the Committee of Congress, General McDougal of New York, Colonel Matthias Ogden of New Jersey, and Colonel John Brooks of Massachusetts, to present to the assembled officers what they have been doing on behalf of the Army, basically lobbying for this pension. And Washington was not supposed to be there. And then all of a sudden he shows up and begs permission to address this esteemed gathering. He gets up there and he reads this incredibly impassioned speech. And at the end, he looks out into the audience and they're just looking at him. And you realize in desperation, I'm not hitting the mark. He had never before ever spoke to his assembled officers. So in desperation, he goes and he reaches for a letter from his friend, a Virginia delegate to the Continental Congress, Joseph Jones. And he pulls it out. Washington's own letter is in very large script because he had written it himself. It's in the Massachusetts Historical Society. The Jones letter is written in normal script. Finally, he gives up and he pulls out the glasses that Philadelphia Benjamin Rittenhouse had made for him. He made all kinds of scientific and technological things like compasses and surveying equipment. And he finally gives up, puts the letter down, and he puts his glasses on. And he goes, "Gentlemen, you forgive me. I've not only grown gray in the service of my country, but nearly blind as well." And for that poignant moment, the great iconic captain on horseback was gone, and in his stead was revealed a fellow sufferer aged beyond his years. People who were in the beginning of the war could remember the red-haired guy with the slightly tinge of gray who took command of that army in Boston in 1775. And now this old man is staring down before him, and a lot of them ashamed of themselves. Because you think of our presidents, think what they look like when they take office, and the weight of the responsibility, what it does to them. And when you think about it, what is the country? Is the country rocks and dirt? No, the country's the people. And no one embodied the country at that time more than Washington. And they realize you're turning against him, who's done everything for you. Some openly wept. Washington, realizing that the compassion, he just quickly gathered up all his papers and left. And General Knox, one of his trusted confidants, led the assembly in denouncing the letters.
And it was a turning point, wasn't it?
Sure. Because think about it, if he hadn't been there, could the conspirators have taken charge of the meeting? Instead of sending another letter saying, "Please do us," maybe the letter would have been, "You've got so many days. You will do what we want or else." And that was the tone of those two letters. And setting the precedent for every time the military is unhappy that they go overthrow the government and put their favorites in charge. Country could have gone a completely different way. Not everybody was sold, though. Colonel Timothy Pickering wrote, "How fickle public assemblies are. A man with only plausibility could move an audience at will." And he didn't vote for renouncing it, but a lot of them felt that they've been sold out.
At that moment, obviously a lot of other things contributed to it, Mike, but just to give again to the idea of the public here, in the late 1700s, we were not on the firmest of footing as a country. And talk about the next 10, 15 years until America finally got its sea legs under it.
Well, people want all the responsibility, want all the benefits of government without any of the responsibilities. If somebody else can pay for it, that's great. If you want protection, you want all these things, the money's got to come from somewhere. And relying upon the states to do the right thing, of course, didn't work. What Maine needs, Georgia doesn't care. The country is very isolated from each other. Even during the war, the fall of Charleston is horrible. Did it affect you in Massachusetts, really? Not really. The country's 1,300 miles long. So it was hard to get this group to work together, but finally they realized many view the country as this great empire, that eventually we're going to surpass Europe. So we need to have, that's what the nationalists wanted. And you have the Annapolis Convention where they're talking about we need to get rid of the Articles of Confederation, which require unanimous vote to get any major legislation passed. And no one's going to unanimously agree to anything. Rhode Island won't cooperate at all because, of course, they're worried, being the smallest state, that they're going to get trounced by the larger states. And that's what will lead to the federal Constitution. You have like Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts. You've got debtors wanting paper money. People who are owed money want coin, haves and have-nots. It's continuing struggle in this country.
And in many ways today, some of the same challenges echoing states' rights versus what's in the best needs of the whole country. But the one thing, Mike, that I think sometimes people forget is the significance of this region in the birth of our nation. I mean, Purple Heart, it came from here. More than that, the Hudson River as a key military choke point here. Talk about those. You got a captive audience right now. Just how important this region was, and it's not just because West Point's here. There's a reason West Point's here.
When you look at the beginning of the American Revolution for our cause, think of, as I mentioned, the 1,300 miles long this country is. Think of all the vulnerable places you have to try to defend, and you can't be strong everywhere. You cannot defend them all. You have to look at places that you can concentrate. New York Harbor is the best natural harbor in the rebelling colonies. You knew the British were going to go after that. The problem we had is New York City is untenable. You cannot defend an island against the strongest naval power on the globe. None of the military wanted to have anything to do with trying to defend it, but New York authorities would not accept that we give up New York without a fight, and we nearly lost half the army in the process. Once New York City was captured in 1776, though there had been fallback fortifications built, Forts Clinton and Montgomery, where Bear Mountain Park is, there had been a small attempted fortification at the location of where West Point would be later. And they realized that New York probably could not be held, so they wanted to have a fallback position. But once the British captured New York, they made a major effort in 1777. You had an army coming out of Canada heading towards Albany, which was stopped at Saratoga. And then you had another army that was heading towards Philadelphia. Washington followed the main British army to Philadelphia, which left the Hudson Highlands barely defended. And that British force that they left behind in New York came up, captured Forts Clinton and Montgomery, and showed how vulnerable those fortifications. And the following year, they built West Point. And West Point is not a fort, it's a series of forts that protect the small choke point in the river where you can easily stretch a chain across. There had been a chain at Fort Montgomery, but once you captured the fort, they just cut it. And you couldn't even see West Point to attack it. And a typical army, when they attack a fortified place, they dig trenches, they connect them, they roll cannons up, pound them down, they dig more trenches. West Point's built on a rock. You would have to assault that. And no professional army is going to lavishly expend their professional soldiers attacking such a place. And this is our biggest concentration of the war. From the Hudson Highlands, the American Army will go to every point of the compass to counter British moves. And that's why Washington and the Army will spend much of their time here.
Finally, Mike, it's clear from this conversation, not just the student, but you love this.
Yes.
And for passerbys like myself and others, when we read that iconic moment that Washington had with his troops, that tenuous point in American history, the public seems to be coming around. Lincoln, obviously, was a revelation to some, at least, as to, again, that point in American history. For those who want to learn the beginnings of it, both here and in the immediate area here in the Valley, it's a great story, isn't it?
It's a fantastic story. And there's so many wonderful... Unfortunately and fortunately, the Hudson Highlands has so many important historic sites, we kind of drown each other out. It's not like you go to some place like out in Montana, I'm sure they have other sites, but Little Bighorn, that's all people think about. But we have so many that you can learn all different aspects. We have Washington's headquarters at Newburgh, the Continental Army encampment at New Windsor, the recreated Temple building. That's where Washington actually made his speech, was over at the Army camp at New Windsor. But there's so many. West Point, Fort Montgomery, Stony Point to the south. It's a wealth of resources which makes an average visitor go, geez, which one do I go see? Yeah. Well, any of them are great. Yeah. And they're going to give you a different outlook on the American Revolution. And
if this did anything to dissuade the maybe general sentiment that once that Declaration of Independence was signed, it was free and easy sailing, not so much. The challenges, and that's where leaders emerge, and as you, I think, so eloquently said, one of George Washington's most defining moments. It was in front of his own men, not just going up the Delaware. So,
and I'll take Wellington, as he said of Waterloo, was a pretty near-run thing. Well, the Revolution was a pretty near-run thing we could have easily lost.
Well, Mike, I really appreciate the time and the hospitality. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.